Ms. Young?
Good morning, Commissioner Lucki.
Good morning.
You're Commissioner of the RCMP,
Yes, I am.
and you have been since 2018.
Yes.
How long have you been with the RCMP?
Since 1986.
I have already interviewed you for a full day, so I'm not going to go over the same ground again. I would like to make the transcript of your interview an exhibit. It's COM 0062475, and that interview took place on August 4th, 2022.
That's Exhibit 4221.
Just to give people an idea of what we've already talked about, we discussed about a dozen topics, including your background, what you were doing during the mass casualty events on April 18th and 19th, 2020, and its immediate aftermath, the information flow from H Division to the RCMP National Headquarters in Ottawa, communications during and after the events, the issues management team at H Division, the draft request for an after-action review of the critical incident, the NOISP review, the treatment of victims' families, post-event resourcing and supports for members, aspects of RCMP member training, the structure of policing, H Division leadership issues, and we talked about some of the evidence you gave at past inquiries. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Today, I'm going to ask you about RCMP culture, after-action reports or reviews or the lack thereof, H Division leadership issues, and the role of communications in the RCMP. Starting with RCMP culture, I'd like you to help us understand how change gets implemented at the RCMP. So, for example, when the commissioners of this inquiry make their recommendations, what happens at RCMP National Headquarters?
Well, thank you. That's a great question because obviously there's been a lot of change. When I became commissioner in 2018, we brought in what we call Vision 150 and then Vision 150 and beyond. And so you can bring in all types of initiative, but there has to be a foundation piece before that. So for example, building trust amongst the employees of the RCMP and leading change. So often if it's something that is not something completely familiar with somebody, it's always best to explain why you're doing the change or why it's important. And sometimes what's the risk of not changing? So that's part of change management. But it's also about, the only things that get done, I believe, are the things that get measured. So it's really important to have tracking mechanisms. So if you look at Vision 150, for example, you can go on our website. We track all the initiatives, provide timelines, milestones, and as important as how things are moving along is why they aren't moving along. So having people regularly report up and explain what's the barrier to implementing this. Is it a question of money, resources? You don't have the proper technology. So it's really important to ensure that it is always brought forward in a regular sort of rhythm. And I think I use Vision 150 because that is our 4 pillars of change. It's our people, our culture, our stewardship, and our policing services. And underneath all 4 of those pillars are all the various ways that we can be a more modern organization and improve our relationships with Indigenous people, make ourselves a more modern policing agency. And so that's a lot of change, and it can't be from the top down. It also has to be from the bottom up and have people buy into that organizational change. And I'm actually quite proud of the employees of the RCMP and how they've been very, very receptive to all the different things that we've been doing in the Vision 150 and beyond.
So when external recommendations come in, who's in charge of absorbing them and figuring out whether and how to implement them?
Well, with external recommendations, the first thing we do is we scrub down the recommendations and try to theme them up and see where they are most prevalent. So is it mostly operational? Is it mostly on the human resources side? And the reason why I say that is because we try to pick a lead that is most appropriate to the actions we're trying to accomplish. Sometimes it covers multiple business lines, but if it's the majority is on human resources, we may pick the Chief Human Resource Officer, or if it's operational, we'd pick the Deputy in charge of Contract and Indigenous Policing. We take that, we lay out all the recommendations in a tracking document. We provide a lead. We divide them into short-term, long-term, medium-term, and start mapping out actions. And so each lead is responsible for that. Since I got in the chair, one of the things that we've really been focusing on is transparency and accountability, outward facing. So many of the things that we've been doing since I became commissioner have been put on our outside website. So for instance, all of our intervention actions are put on our website. All the actions of different various reports, the recommendations are put on the website with a tracking document so the public can see how we are faring in implementing recommendations. Again, with that comes regular reporting. And if people miss a diary date or a date that they've set out to do something, we need to know why. Because I find sometimes when you get a report, there's all this energy in the first 3 to 5 months, 6 months, and then it sort of fizzles off. So if you don't keep up with the regular reporting and the tracking and letting the public see what you're doing so that they are in fact helping us be accountable.
Is that your intention with this Commission of Inquiry?
Absolutely.
And when you say we will decide who to lead, do you mean you, or is it a group of people?
No, I'm a very collaborative type leader, and so my senior executive committee, we meet up to 3 times a week, and I always like to speak with people who are impacted by decisions that we make, whether it's internal or external, and try to get a sense, because there's so much going on in the RCMP with 32,000 employees and 750 locations. I can't have my finger on the pulse, and so I rely on my team, and I rely on our senior management team, which is all the commanding officers as well.
Leaving aside recommendations that would require legislative change, so that would require Parliament, if it's something that's not of that nature, but perhaps more of a policy or implementation nature, can the RCMP decide on its own what to do and what to implement, or does there have to be government or political approval?
Well, each and every initiative, we would have sort of an action plan. So if it was legislative, obviously we don't control for legislation, but we can also be the subject matter experts in helping to initiate legislation, so that might be our role. If it requires funding, for example, something or a certain technology, well, then that would be in the action plan, and it might take longer. There might, in fact, be some recommendations. If we're not working with the Commission on the recommendations, there might, in fact, be recommendations, and that is that we can't implement. And so I found that in previous reports where sometimes it's too prescriptive or too granular, and it makes it difficult sometimes for us to implement those recommendations.
So you've been involved in this process before?
Excuse me?
You've been involved in this process before of implementing recommendations?
For example, when I became commissioner shortly after, we had the Bastarash report, and there was an example I can give out of that is there was a recommendation on having daycares in every detachment, for example. It was a little too granular because first and foremost, for liability reasons, I don't think we would have children in our detachments at a daycare. But if you bring it up 1 or 2 levels and talk about providing support for shift workers, then daycare might be but one of those solutions. Care for the elderly if people are dealing with that situation, different aspects of what happens when you're a shift worker. And looking at it at a higher level gives us more flexibility to provide that support and implement the recommendation.
You mean if the recommendations are pitched at a higher level rather than getting into detail about how the objectives should be reached?
Yeah, a very good point. Sometimes it's great to know what you're trying to accomplish, but if we can decide how to do that, we usually get better results.
You said if you're not working with a commission, what do you mean by that?
It's absolutely important that the commission is completely independent, but we are not immune to reviews. We've had a lot of reviews, and we have a lot of review bodies. And often when a review body is going to take on some form of review, they will come to us and we'll speak about the scope and have that discussion. Ultimately, the review body, it's their decision on the scope, but consulting often helps narrow down what they're trying to accomplish. When they get to recommendations, it's important. We have a lot of our review bodies who give us a draft of their recommendations, and we can weigh in. It doesn't mean that we're going to change anybody's mind. That's not. It's just to provide context and say, you know what? Maybe if you did this, it would give us more flexibility to accomplish more tasks, or to better approach that if it's not so prescriptive.
What factors other than the recommendations themselves does the RCMP need to take into account when going through the implementation process?
Well, obviously finances, resourcing. We will stand up a team when we have major reports, so we have to, obviously we don't have financing or additional resources sitting there waiting to do these types of work, and it is very intensive, especially in the first 6 months to a year when you're trying to set the road to success. So it might be legislative, it might be contrary to legislation, it might be contrary to some operational policy. It doesn't mean that it's not still doable or implementable. There just might be more steps, or there may be an explanation as to why we can't implement it in the way that it's suggested. However, we can do this. I always say, and it's been my sort of mantra for several years of my career, is never start the conversation with no. Like, let's try to see how we can do something. And I think these recommendations and the implementation, it's a non-negotiable for us.
Have you thought about how this process is going to work with this inquiry?
Yeah, absolutely. We haven't gotten into any details because we want to see, like I said, scrub them down, theme them up, and see who's the best to lead. Of course, we know that some of the recommendations we've already worked on, because anything that may affect the safety of Canadians and the safety of the first responders, keeping Canadians safe, we can't wait till we have recommendations from the Commission. So, for example, the Alert Ready. That was a huge issue. So, of course, Nova Scotia has worked with their provincial counterparts. They've created policy on that. We've taken it one step further, and we obviously share everything with all the other commanding officers. And there's a lot of police agencies outside the RCMP who are wanting information as well, because it's one of those non-negotiables. We can't wait for the recommendations. So we've created national policy, and now we're looking at training and awareness. Each province right now has their own system, and there will be a review to see if there's a possibility of a national system, because we're a decentralized organization and people move from province to province, the more we can not standardize but speak with one voice, excuse me, the more we can make things standard from one place to another, the easier it is for the frontline personnel to know what to do when they move from Nova Scotia to New Brunswick. They're not learning a whole new system. So the more we can keep things similar, they might not be identical, but I have another mantra that says one voice with flexibility, and we need to speak with that one voice, but we have to have the flexibility, because what we can do in Lower Mainland BC cannot be done in Prince Edward Island or Northwest Territories.
Yes, and we were talking to retired Assistant Commissioner Bergman yesterday about whether any implementation could happen directly at the divisional level. And so her perspective was, yes, that that commanding officer could act on some recommended changes without waiting for approval from national headquarters, and if it was a question of resources, could go directly to the province to fund those initiatives. Do you agree with that, or would you want divisions to wait until national headquarters decided whether or how to implement recommendations?
Anything that would affect the safety of Canadians or the people responding, we can't wait. We can't wait and say, oh, we have another incident and we sat back and did nothing. These things that are tactical and have a high risk, we need to deal with. Other things we can wait, and I don't completely agree that it's up to the division to be implementing everything. I think it's a combination, because some things have national implications, and even if the division may not think it's national, we want, again, if something has been identified in Nova Scotia that is so important that it's a recommendation in Nova Scotia, it is probably something that across the country in the RCMP, for example, we should look at, but go one step further and talk about it with other police agencies. Since I became commissioner, I created what I call the Chiefs of Police Roundtable. We talk about a lot of different commonalities and issues. And of course, people are interested in what we do because often we have resources to do a bit more research or to implement things. So an example is we're in the midst of implementing body-worn cameras. In our procurement process, we are creating an avenue for all police agencies to use our contract. Why? Because a policing agency of 10 or 20 or 50 may not be able to afford the research and all the policy and the training that goes along with implementation, so we like to share that. It doesn't mean they have to use it, but at least they have the option.
Who are the members of that organization?
There's 1 to 2 representatives from each province and territory, and it's policing chiefs. It's chiefs of various police agencies representing big municipalities, small Indigenous police agencies, and medium size across from coast to coast to coast.
Is that a voluntary body focused on policymaking?
It's focused on issues such as systemic racism was one of the issues, which led into crisis intervention and de-escalation. Our first goal was to create the first ever one model across the entire country of all police agencies of crisis intervention and de-escalation. We're right now, we created a task force. They're in the consultation phase with the communities most affected by our intervention. There's a real appetite to be speaking with the same voice more than ever, and having a strong voice in policing. We're very fortunate in Canada. There's 194 police agencies as opposed to 18,000 in the United States. So we have the ability to speak more with one voice. And I don't think years ago there was much of an appetite for that. Everybody was kind of going their own way, but they realized that there's strength in numbers of doing things together. So we have a task force on de-escalation and crisis intervention. We have one on calls to mental wellness, external facing. And the third one we just created was hate crimes.
The idea of different police forces speaking with one voice is not always well received by other chiefs of police. For example, in Nova Scotia, the perception of some municipal chiefs of police was the RCMP just wanted that one voice to be the voice of the RCMP. So how do you deal with that?
I agree with you. When I first got in the chair, I kept hearing the expression, the big red machine. And I went, honestly, that's not who we are. That's not who we want to be. And we're better together. And so I say relationships have to be built every single day, just like trust. You don't gain it and then put a check mark and say, okay, we're done. You really need to focus on that relationship and build it during good times. And then when things are not so good, it happens because you've built the relationship beforehand. I think we often take relationships for granted and think, yeah, we've built it, it's all good. But people change, ideas change, pressures change. If you're competing for the same dollars within a province, it's sometimes difficult because you say to yourself, you know what, maybe we're looking as if we're trying to take control instead of actually trying to assist. And so it's important that you build that relationship of trust and credibility before you start trying to have conversations about policing standards or having conversations about how we can work better together.
In your experience, can the culture of the RCMP be a barrier to accepting recommendations for change?
Anything can be a barrier, absolutely, but in my experience since I've been commissioner, I've never seen such a great willingness for people to change. Our generations thrive on change, and especially when it comes to anything, training, tactical, equipment, uniform, anything that can make them respond better or more efficiently or more effectively, they're on it. Like you don't even have to manage that change, they're just begging for more and more. But when you're looking at things that aren't operational, like culture change, and looking at things when you talk about systemic racism or systemic barriers, sometimes it's harder. And that's when I refer to, talking about why it's important. What's the risk of doing it, and what's the risk of not doing it? And having people buy into it. You know, you have to make sure that people buy into it, because otherwise it's really a waste of time. And so ideas have to come from the bottom up. You can't just say to yourself, I'm the commissioner of the RCMP and my senior executive committee we're right and this is what we're going to do, because well, the old expression, you can lead a horse to water but you can't make them drink. So how do they become part of the solution, part of the ideas? And we've seen it with Vision 150 and the buy-in and the excitement around that, and we've really been able to push the envelope and move the yardstick quite a bit in those initiatives.
Have you seen that mentality change over the years since 1986?
Sorry, change?
Have you seen the approach to change since 1986?
Oh my goodness, yes. 1986, yikes. You know, it's interesting, when I was a commanding officer, and I would go to Ottawa and see the big table. And I remember it was very rank conscious, and it was on one side of the table was all the people from Ottawa, and on the other side of the table were all, there was only 2 female COs, and we were all on one side of the table, and the lower your rank, the further you were from the center. It was very rank conscious. And I remember, and I was not thinking of being the commissioner at this point, but I said, if I was ever commissioner, I would never have this table. I hate this table. I hate what this table represents. And so when I got there, I had the opportunity, I remember bringing up something at that table and getting shut down. And I said, that is not conducive to creativity, innovation, hearing people's points of view. So it was really important to me when I got in the chair to create a table where people could speak honestly and forthright, be respectful, challenge the commissioner, challenge the senior executive committee, challenge the commanding officers, and be able to speak freely. And we can do it in breakout sessions, we can do it together in groups, we're at round tables, people are mixed and matched, there is no rank in that table, and I'm really proud of that. And when I got to the table, first of all, when I first joined the RCMP, every single senior executive was a white male and was a police officer. Now my senior executive committee is a mix of civilians and regular members. There's males and there's more females actually. We have diversity in experience, diversity in color, we have diversity in gender. And our commanding officers, when I came in as commissioner, there was 2 commanding officers that were female. At one point, we were over 50% female. We're a little bit below 50% because of some of the changes. And I'm so proud of that, because it just lends so many different lenses to everything. And we do really work on using the gender-based analysis plus on everything we do, including equipment. So when we're in the midst of evergreening our firearm, do we need a 10-pound trigger pull on a firearm? Does that eliminate small-statured people? How can we be more inclusive? So everything's about being more inclusive, more diverse, and more accountable.
When thinking about change, does the possibility of litigation or the reality of litigation impact how the RCMP reviews itself and how it communicates to the public?
It's definitely a consideration of one of many, because we have to think of the risks and we have to think of the benefits. So sometimes a risk of litigation, that would maybe change us to go to our legal services and say, okay, this is what we're doing, what's the risks? Because we're not the experts in that. We have people smarter than us in legal services who will do all that, and they would outline the risks. And then it's up to us as decision makers to say, can we mitigate these risks? And then make the decision. If something is not mitigatable, then maybe we have to change the course, slightly alter it, but it doesn't mean that we again start with no. I think it's just being more open to trying to make change, and you don't want to be holding yourself liable every time you make change, because you couldn't sustain yourself as an organization if you were making change and getting sued every time you made a change. So it is definitely part of our decision making.
I'm going to turn to the mass casualty events and the various after-action reports and reviews that have been discussed, but as far as we know, none completed. We did talk about this a bit in your witness interview, and again, the transcript number is COM 62475, and that was at pages 59 to 63, just for people's reference. You did say you weren't too familiar with all the details, so I'm not going to ask you questions at that level, but we did go through yesterday with retired Assistant Commissioner Bergman several reports and reviews of portions of the police response that were considered with respect to the mass casualty events. So I counted up 8. So there's the concept of an after-action report of a mass casualty event, which wasn't done by the division. Secondly, there was the NOISIP review, and that was the investigative file assessment, which was started at the national level but suspended due to criminal charges. Third, there was a draft request for an independent review of the critical incident response, which was put forward by Superintendent John Robbins, Superintendent Campbell, and Chief Superintendent Chris Leather, but appears to have been informally declined by Contract and Indigenous Policing. Then there was an IRT after-action report, which the authors say was more or less finalized, but it's in draft in the sense that it doesn't appear to have been signed off on or approved. There's an EMERT draft report, so Emergency Medical Response Team. And then there was some sort of informal review done by email by Superintendent Demopoulos of the Issues Management Team. He sent emails for feedback with apparently very little response. So those are 6 internal ones. And then there was the ESDC, Employment and Social Development Canada investigation, because there was a workplace occupational injury or death at a federally regulated workplace, so that's ongoing. Then there's the Hoyt, Hazardous Occurrence Investigating Team investigation, which is a Canada Labour Code investigation. So those first 6 are internal to the RCMP. The last 2 are mandated by statute and are external. None of them were finished. So just looking at the first 6, on the first one, an after-action report, Deputy Commissioner Brennan said in his interview that there's a policy requiring that, but we haven't seen that policy, I don't believe. Are you aware of such a policy existing?
Vaguely, not intimately.
Okay. Do you know what it requires?
Not intimately. I think it has to do with doing a review, and then it translates itself into some tabletop exercises, I believe, but I'm not completely familiar with it.
Ms. Bergman was saying this morning that she was aware of it, but that she did not order one. She agreed with Deputy Commissioner Brennan that it would be a divisional responsibility, but she was just too worried about getting enough resources to keep things going at H Division. So in that scenario, would it make sense for the CO to appeal for help at the national level with an after-action review?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what happened, when I look at this, because when you asked me the question at the interview, of course, I did a bit more digging in all of this because I was surprised at all the different reviews internally. Right after the incident, within days, there was already a talk about an inquiry. We already knew that there would be an ESDC report looking at the Canadian Labour Code. We knew there was going to be a Hoyt review. These are pretty standard. We normally often do a critical incident review, but sometimes when there's a bunch of different things happening, sometimes we will wait. The critical incident review, for example, or an after action can sometimes be done at any time. There's no prescribed time. And sometimes we look at the whole picture to see what is going on, and do we want to re-interview people multiple times, or do we want to take everything and deconflict it at the end and find out where the gaps are? And for instance, I know with the IRT and the EMERT report, both were completed actually, but they weren't, all the recommendations are not completed. So they've come to their conclusions. There's recommendations, I think it's like half a dozen or so, or more for each report. Some of the recommendations have been completed in those, and they were on specific activities, obviously, the emergency response team and the emergency medical response team. And there's also been, like, for example, OCC excuse me, the Operational Communication Center has done some reviews on interoperability between radio systems, encryption and unencrypted radio systems. They've done some things on a scrub down of their entire system to see if their standard operating procedures fit in the context of what happened. So there has been these little one-off reviews on units, but an after action or a critical incident, the decision I know specifically with the critical incident report was made to wait till many of these others reviews were done and see where the gaps are, and then decide if there were in fact gaps in our reviews and decide what to review at that point.
Do you know whose decision it was not to proceed with the critical incident review?
It was brought forward by the division, and it was brought into the contract and Indigenous policing deputy, not even at his level, it was brought to the assistant commissioner level and the critical incident program. And they looked at it, and what they do is they look at it and say, okay, what are we trying to accomplish here? Is there anything else that will accomplish this or anything else that will affect this? And they felt between the ESDC, the Hoyt, the inquiry, and some of the smaller reviews they were doing, that they would wait and hold it in abeyance. It doesn't mean that it's not going to get done, but at the end of the day, if everything has been reviewed and there's zero gaps, which I'm not sure would happen, but if there were zero gaps in the in all the different reviews, then we would have to look at what wasn't reviewed and make sure that was covered.
The draft request for the critical incident review from March of 2021 was emailed to Jamie Salem, who I gather is just retired. So would it have, but Commissioner, Ms. Bergman thought it was Dennis Daly's decision to refuse that review. When you say they, do you know, was there a particular person whose decision it was?
Well, it would have, first of all, Jamie Salem was in charge of the critical incident program. She would have reviewed it. Her boss is Dennis Daly. He would in fact review it, and he may have even had a discussion with Deputy Commissioner Brian Brennan. Because again, people don't want to just automatically say no. They want to make sure that at the end of the day, we're accomplishing what we're setting out to accomplish. And maybe it's not a no, it's just maybe a not now, and let's hold it off until we see what happens. And so ultimately, I believe it would have been Dennis Daly, but it may in fact have been Deputy Commissioner Brian Brennan. I don't intimately know. So it was
under their responsibility?
Yeah, it was in that business line of contract and Indigenous policing.
Likely with some consultation between them, it sounds like. And the request wasn't signed formally by the division, and so it wasn't formally declined. Is that usual, that that they would be given an informal no, so kind of not bother sending in the formal request, or decide not to?
I'm not sure what the usual event is or the order of affairs. I'm not familiar, and the only thing I keep thinking when people ask me in regards to this event, there was nothing usual about this event, so I don't know if bringing it forward was usual or not. I know that obviously capacity within the division was an issue, but that's not why we wouldn't review something, because it's about us providing them the capacity if they need to. And often in the case, you don't want the division reviewing themselves anyways. So maybe it was a question of, let's not re-interview a lot of people that will be interviewed during the inquiry, during the ESDC and the Hoyt. Let's wait and see. And sometimes you can actually do a document review if everything has been covered. I'm not saying whether this would be the case or not, but it is a possibility.
But it doesn't, it is certainly an unusual scale of event, but it doesn't sound like anyone sat down and said, okay, here's all the different ways we could sit down and think about what went right, what went wrong. Let's decide which one we're doing and who's doing it. Like, are we doing something at the national level? Are we doing something at the divisional level? And sort of rationalize the approach to after-action reports or reviews. That didn't happen as far as you're aware, did it?
Well, I do know that certain events, like for example, when they talk about the Alert Ready, they did, fulsome reviews, looked at, they needed policy, looked at working with the province, figuring out how that translates itself on the ground operationally, And since then, I know there's been almost a dozen incidents within just the province of Nova Scotia, for example, where that's been used. So that in itself was a review. It wasn't a full after-action review from A to Z. It only covered the alert ready. And I think what they did was they gleaned out some of the things that were high risk and saying we need to review these first because we can't wait. So instead of doing a full A to Z review, pulling out things that may have been high risk is how I understood it.
You did sign a briefing note advising the Minister of Public Safety that there was a NOISIP review underway. That was of the investigation after the moment that the critical incident ended. And I believe it's already an exhibit. Can we see COM 0043946, just to refresh your memory?
That's Exhibit 4173.
So it says, issue to provide you with an update regarding the status of ongoing investigations into multiple homicides. If you can just scroll down to the bottom so that you can see. So that's signed by you, dated December 4th, 2020, which is the date that criminal charges were laid in this matter.
Yeah, it's, from what I understood on the noise review is, first of all, it's about the investigation. And as soon as the investigation was brought into play and the charges were laid, at the first instance, they had intended to bring people from outside the division and start doing a review. But what happened was with the COVID restrictions and with the capacity in some of the divisions, because there's specific experts in this field that do these reviews, they weren't able to get people in the ground. And then all of a sudden charges were being laid. So as soon as that happens, the noise review is held in abeyance. And so again, after our interview, I followed up on it and found out, obviously, because in July, the charges were dealt with in court, and we usually wait on the noise review to have everything dealt with in court. So now it has been dealt with in court, so I inquired as to what we were doing, and it's being reinvigorated, and a full major case management review will be done.
So it will be reactivated?
Yes.
Okay, and just to point out, could we scroll up a bit, please, Madam Registrar? So if you could stop there. I guess go up again. Down again, please. I think it's under strategic considerations.
Yeah, that was the intention. Obviously, in the first paragraph is to send people down there. And then, and then following the charges in December, they're going to reevaluate certain areas that no longer.
Yeah, so at that point, you're advising the minister that the review is ongoing. We did see another situation report from January 2021 to say it had been suspended due to the criminal charges, although it doesn't seem to be mentioned in this document. So
it's kind of ironic that it would say that we were, it was ongoing when charges have been laid, because
yes.
usually once charges are laid, we usually put that in abeyance. So it must have been just a question of fluke timing or something.
Okay. And one thing was, we saw the mandate letter for this review yesterday from August of 2020, and it was sent to the head of the MCUH division, not copied to then CO Bergerman, and she testified that even as of yesterday, she didn't know that there had been a NOISIP review begun. Did that surprise you?
Well, it would, unless people assume that she would know, and we know what happens when you assume. So it was, I'm surprised that they didn't brief her on it and say, okay, this is what we're going to do, because you obviously want your commanding officer to have, they might not, as per myself, you don't know things intimately, but you're aware that they exist. And if it comes to wanting to know more information, you at least know it exists, and you can request. You can also request, updates. But if you don't know it exists, it's pretty hard to do that. So I was fairly surprised.
So you would have expected her officers to brief her on that review happening, right?
I would assume, or at least, the criminal operations officer would be the one who would be overseeing that because they see everything operational. And often there's a lot of things going on in a division, so not everything gets briefed up to the commanding officer, of every single thing that happens, but anything of importance, and I would say that this probably reaches that threshold, that they would probably want to advise her that it was in progress.
And DC Brennan indicated in his commission interview, and that transcript is COM 63046, at around page 80, he talked about this noise review potentially starting up again, and he said that national headquarters would engage H Division. So you would expect that perhaps this time they'd make sure that everyone at H Division actually knew the review was starting up again?
Yeah, absolutely.
Next, I'm going to ask you about leadership issues in H Division. We did touch on it before somewhat, and we talked about a little bit about the Wellness Assessment Summary Report, which was from September of 2021. I don't think we need to see it this moment, but it's COM 62465. You recall that I did show it to you on screen during your interview, and that was the first time you had actually seen the document, is that right? No, you had seen it before.
The wellness review?
Yes.
No, I saw the wellness review in June, just a few days prior to coming to Nova Scotia for Constable Heidi's.
That was 2022?
Yes.
Okay. Would you have expected to have seen it sooner, given that it was completed in September of 2021?
Yeah, I was quite surprised. It didn't. I didn't think about it during that time, and it wasn't until I was going to Nova Scotia and I was having a town hall with the officers, and one of the potential questions was, can we have an update on the wellness review? And all of a sudden, I was like, oh my goodness, I hadn't even thought of the wellness review. It had fallen off my radar. And so when I went to find out, I knew that I was at that time advised that, yeah, it was still on the radar, that the report had been finished in September 2021, I believe. I had not gotten a copy of the report, so I quickly reviewed it before going to H Division. I had, I told them that we were going to give them more information going forward, and that there was some work to be done.
When you say you went to find out, who did you go to find out from?
It was with both the activity was being sort of co-run by primarily the Chief Human Resource Officer as well as the Deputy Commissioner Brennan were co-facilitating the process, if you want to say.
Why were you going to Nova Scotia in June of 2022 or July?
Yeah, I was going for Constable Heidi Stevenson's memorial, and at the same time, usually when I travel anywhere to any of the divisions, I try to have town halls with different groups and visit different attachments if I can.
So what we talked about, the document that the Commission has, is a summary report. Have you ever seen the full report?
Yes.
So that does exist?
Yes.
And the summary we saw summarized feedback from H Division officers to the effect that dysfunctional relationships with provincial and municipal partners had been allowed to continue for years. Were you aware of that dynamic prior to reading the report?
I wasn't intimately knowing about that from before the mass casualty, but in recent months I received a letter from the president of the Nova Scotia Association of Chiefs of Police talking about changing the status of the RCMP in that organization, and that's when obviously, when I got the letter, I dug deeper and said, what's going on here? Why is this happening? And I knew, obviously, I don't follow the media intimately, but I knew that there was some strain in some of the events at the mass casualty event between some of the police agencies. So I wasn't oblivious to the fact that there was some strains in the relationship. I didn't know to what extent, but when I received the letter and replied back, that's when I received more information.
And I should note that the Commission has subpoenaed the full quintet report.
Okay.
Ms. Bergman yesterday appeared to disagree that
Sorry.
relations... Sorry. Oh, microphone?
Thank you. Thank you. I just thought it would be a good time to clarify that the report that was provided to the Commission is the only report. There is no other version. I know it's called a summary report, but there's no longer version of that report. It is just the one report.
Ms. McPhee is giving evidence that's contradicting the evidence the witness is giving on the stand, so...
There is only, I've only seen one report.
Oh, okay, I thought...
I know we did provide, when I say summary, the officers in the division were given an email that provided a summary of the themes, but those themes were gleaned out of the report. There was no short version or executive summary report. It was all just one report. Sorry for the
Can we
confusion.
see the document, please, Madam Registrar?
Yes, we'll get that clarified to make sure.
So it says on the title page, summary report, wellness assessment. And that is the document that I was talking to you
Yeah.
about in your interview.
Yeah, and there is no other documents in regards to this wellness assessment. This is the one and only document that we got from the company.
So I'd understood you to say a moment before Ms. McPhee said this was the only document, that there was also a full report that you have seen.
No, I think when you referred to the full report, I was talking about the unredacted version. I saw it unredacted, and then obviously I saw it redacted.
Can we just scroll down a little bit, please, Madam Registrar? Keep going. And scroll down some more, please. Maybe just slowly. So here we have on page 4 the counter sections. I believe this is, if you can just scroll up a bit to see the heading on this section. This is key elements of the statement of work. So this has ellipses between paragraphs, so they're excerpts. So that appears to be not the complete statement of work. Have you seen the full statement of work?
I believe I have, but I didn't read it intimately, but there is, when we were going through the, it's one part of the procurement process, is a statement of work.
Okay, and the Commission has also subpoenaed that document, the statement of work. So Ms. Bergman's perspective that she said yesterday was that relations between the RCMP and municipal partners in Nova Scotia were not really that bad before the events, but that they deteriorated after the mass casualty once the RCMP started being subject to public criticism. Are you aware of any change in dynamics between H Division leadership and its provincial and municipal partners before and after the events?
Not before, only from what the media was reporting afterwards, or what was, what was coming out of the, the different reactions to the operational response.
The report that we've seen cited significant morale issues within the ranks of H Division officers. Is that something you would have liked to know about at the time the report was completed in September of 2021?
I was made privy, I got periodic briefings on what was happening in H Division and when they decided to do the wellness review. So I didn't get like full intimate things of what was going on, but Deputy Commissioner Brennan had had spoken to a few employees, was going down to H Division to do more fact finding. And then as a result, like anything, we try to get things dealt with at the lowest level. And I believe he had tasked the commanding officer and the crops officer to do some work in improving the situation. And then as a result, he did come to the senior executive committee and say, okay, the issues are still there. And the CHRO at the time, who's since retired, had dealings with doing a wellness report with that particular company and said, there is possibilities if you want to do an independent review to get to the bottom of all the issues, you could do this. And then he brought that idea forth to the senior executive committee, and he had decided that he was going to do such a report. I think we discussed it slightly, like just on the peripheral, and he and the CHRO went into a procurement process to secure the independent company to do the review. So there was the procurement process, the terms of reference, the statement of work, and then, of course, I believe they did 20-plus interviews as part of their review, 25 or 30.
Do you know how this particular firm was selected, Quintet?
I think they had a standing offer, so it made the procurement process easier, is what I was told, I believe.
Do you know that there are former RCMP people working at Quintet?
No, I had no idea.
Were you concerned when you heard that there were wellness issues in H Division leadership?
Oh, I'm always concerned. I wasn't surprised completely because I think what that division went through post this mass casualty, and hearing criticism about your people or your division or your organization within the province is not easy to take. And of course, giving people a confidential voice to allow themselves to speak freely about any of the issues. I think a lot of things come out as a result of it, and not undermining anything that was said. We just have to go through that, scrub it down, and figure out what the issues are, what the root causes are, if you want to be solution-based. So it's all about, even though somebody might have said something that they believed, I'm not saying it's not true, it's just, is it an issue that needs to be dealt with, or is there a bigger issue, or is there something completely else, and trying to deconflict what everybody is saying and come up with what are the issues and how can we come to solutions.
When it occurred to you relatively recently that you hadn't seen this report and you went and asked about it, was there an explanation given to you about why it wasn't brought to your attention in a timely way?
No, there wasn't a big explanation because the person who was the keeper of the report, the previous CHRO, had since retired, and it was only the new CHRO who had been in the position for weeks, maybe not even 6 weeks, that was in the process of dealing with it. So she had no real explanation, obviously, because that was stemmed back from September 2021. Deputy Commissioner Brennan was part of that, but from what I understood, the dealing with the company, the rolling out of the Quintet contract was done on the CHRO side, and so I'm not sure why he didn't come forward, or the then CHRO. I was completely surprised. I was surprised that it had been out for months, like 6 to 8 months, and I wasn't aware of it.
And you're aware that it was initially suggested by CO Bergerman that there were these problems, and she went to DC Brennan, and that's how it came about? That's not the understanding I had in briefings with DC Brennan. I think Deputy Commissioner Brennan has quite an extensive relationship in Nova Scotia, so he knows a lot of people that are working there, and I think a few people reached out to him to voice some concerns. Then that's when he decided to go down to the division and interview some people to see the extent of the problem. And as a result of that, that's when he brought that to the attention of the commanding officer, then Lee Bergerman, and the crops officer, Chief Superintendent Leather, and sort of gave them the opportunity. Here are the issues. Let's see it, let's get a plan. Let's deal with it, and deal with it at your level. And obviously that didn't. I'm assuming, of course, it didn't work, because then they got into hiring an independent company to do a full wellness review. Once the review is done, though, wouldn't you think it would be important for the CO of H Division to know the results as soon as possible so they could start implementing any recommendations?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, I know that people have told me that they have been working on some of the recommendations, but honestly, the second that report is out and you scrub it down and you decide who's going to take the lead from there and theme up, again, like I said, the recommendations and start working on an action plan. It should include the division, obviously, because the wellness review is of the division.
It didn't, though. So the report was completed September of 2021. CO Bergerman didn't retire till October 2021. It was never provided to her. It was not provided to her successor. And it appears that it was only shared with H Division in July of 2022.
I think part of it is, if I recall, Assistant Commissioner Bergman had retired in 2021, I think, at the end of.
But after the report, she was there till October of
Yes.
2021.
And the report came out at the end of September, so it might have just been, well, she's, her last working days are within a month, I'm guessing. And then there was no successor right away that was in the position, so it was acting Commanding Officer Chris Leather, who should have been made aware of it.
Well, not only that, we've heard evidence that in an interview that Chris Leather, when he was acting CO, asked for it. He asked for it in late fall of 2021 after it was completed, and it wasn't provided to him. Do you know why that was?
No, I have no idea. I just know that the intention was when we got the report and the way that the report was written, and I'm obviously finding this out after the fact, it was written in such a way that it didn't protect the confidentiality of the many people who came forward, and many came forward because it was going to be confidential and they could speak freely. And the way it was written in certain respects wasn't respecting the confidentiality. So I don't think anybody had an intention after they read the report to say, okay, we're just going to share this freely. It needed to be either given an executive summary with the recommendations and an action plan, or it needed to be properly vetted because it did not protect the confidentiality of the participants that was guaranteed at the onset.
What's your view of the usefulness of the report then, if it can't be shared in the way it was intended?
I think that lessons learned when we go down this road again, if we're ever doing a wellness review, the report needs to be written in such a way that it can be shared. If there are issues that are one-off issues or something that would not protect the confidentiality, then maybe it's a separate conversation. But you can't have things that identify what people said when they're told that it's confidential. They can't be identified because that's against the protocol that you set up in place. If you were to say, listen, you're getting interviewed and everything is going to be disclosed, well, that's the rules, then you know going forward. I don't know how honest of an assessment you would get in that case, and so that's why it worries me in this particular report, because the participants were provided, were told that they were going to remain confidential. I'm worried now going forward how, as an organization, how we would ever do any more wellness reports, because if it was me, I don't think I would ever participate in one, only because if it's totally disclosed to the public and it discloses some of the participants' comments that can be identifiable to the participant, that worries me. I think for the Commission's use, I truly believe that the Commission should have access to it, having access, but I don't know how it should be. Maybe they can translate what is in that report into things that will protect the confidentiality of the participants and use it in a very closed type setting. That's just my feelings.
So in terms of the report having any utility for change in H division, you're saying, given the way it was written, ideally the key points would have been taken out with an action plan sent to H division. Did that ever happen to your knowledge?
No, only recently, because when I was going to H division, then of course I found out that the report had been completed. I also was told that there was some small email in December and then in January talking about the report in general and some themes, and that they were going to work through it and come to some actions. I only learned this recently. When I spoke to the officers in E division, I committed to them getting minimally a summary and getting a list of each and every recommendation, and that if an action plan was not created, that an action plan would be created and shared with the participants. So all of that has happened, but only recently.
July of 2022?
Yes, yeah.
So you don't really know why National Headquarters didn't act on it sooner?
I just think someone dropped the ball or it fell through the cracks amongst 100 other things. I'm not even sure. Like it's really unfortunate because I sort of feel if participants take the time to come forward and be interviewed, then they have a right to know what's going to happen. And how are you going to fix something if you don't, follow through? And it's closing that loop. And that's why I think because I'm such a stickler about compliance and closing the loop, I was wasn't happy with the fact that, I know that there are some things, though, I will say, that have been worked on unofficially, like not through a tracking document, but I know that the CHRO has been working, previous CHRO is working through some of the things. But again, in the spirit of transparency and accountability, that just sort of falls against that. So we do need, like, that needed to be done better.
That was almost a year where the dysfunction and problems with retention were allowed to continue, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Ms. Bergman said a number of her officers complained to her after the events about feeling burnout and wanting to start charting their course to retirement and so on. Did you ever consider whether the demands of reporting up to national headquarters and aligning public messaging with national headquarters was itself a stressor on the senior leadership at H Division?
Well, in a general sense, in any of our major events, there always is sort of a spike in attrition. Some people just reevaluate their life and say, you know what, I'm at the retirement age, or I'm gonna, this is too stressful, sort of do a self-evaluation. So that's not unusual. To say that it's attributable to the headquarters and divisional relationship, I don't think for the majority of the people they're thinking in those terms. I think they're thinking about the effect of what happened and the negative narrative that resulted, and Canadians losing trust in their local RCMP, which up to then they had a fairly good relationship with the citizens of Nova Scotia. So post-event, it's really hard to listen to that, and it's really hard to take that, because as a manager, I know when I was a district officer and I'd hear criticism, I would know that the majority of my people are out there doing a great job, connecting with the community, working hard, solving crime, stopping crime, but then things happen, and you don't want that to be a defining moment. You don't want that to be a turning point, and that's sort of what happened. And I think it was a hard pill to swallow for the managers, because they take it in internally, and I honestly wouldn't expect anything differently, because I think as commissioner, and I'm far removed directly in this situation, and when I saw the narrative in the news and I see some of the narrative or some of the, the theories that are out there, it's hard to take. I'm not a person who watches the news, but I hear enough of it that I couldn't imagine, day in and day out listening to that. If that does not have a negative effect on you, and if that doesn't want to make you want to retire, if you're at that age where you can, it's hard. And my hat's off to the people who have, worked through it and, come on the other end of that. I don't know, it's not an easy task to do. It saddens me and it hurts me to see some of the effects that it had on people. I look at the senior managers. I look at Lee Bergman, I look at Chris Leather, and I look at Darren Campbell. They were under extreme pressure all the time and carrying the weight of the division. I know what it's like, because often I carry the weight of the RCMP, and it's not an easy thing to be a leader and under that criticism. And it's not just criticism on this event. We had the events of George Floyd and criticism of systemic racism in policing, not just the RCMP, in policing. And it affects our recruiting when people don't want to join your organization. And before this, we had thousands of people wanting to join our organization. That's got to take a toll on you. I know it does, because it takes a toll on me every single day. And I think, how can we do better? And we need to do better. And how can we be more modern? And I said that when I took the job, I said I would not leave any stone unturned. And I joke and I say I didn't realize I was in a gravel pit, because there's a lot of stones that you have to, modernization doesn't stop and it doesn't start. Like all of a sudden I can say, oh, today we are now modern. It doesn't work like that. Every single thing that we look at, we have to say, okay, we need to change this, but it's good enough right now, because we don't have the resources to do everything. This one, it can wait another year. This one, oh my gosh, no, we got to do this one right now. So it's prioritizing things and making change. And I equate it to dieting. I did not gain weight overnight. I'm not going to lose it overnight. The second I do a quick fix, I will regain that weight. So culture change in a big organization of 32,000 people takes time. And for it to be sustainable, it has to take time, because if it's a quick fix, it will come and go. It'll be the treat of the week, the flavor of the month. I don't want to make change like that. I want things to be very strategic, very succinct, and very sustainable. So it's all about creating processes, which we will do in Nova Scotia, so that when Lee comes and goes, and now Dennis Daly's going in the chair, when Dennis Daly comes and goes, it's not going to drop because Dennis Daly had a good idea. And as soon as he leaves, oh, it's gone. No, it has to be process and protocol, policy, procedure. People have to know what you're doing. You have to communicate it. So there's a lot of work to changing a culture.
That was one thing that Chief Superintendent Leather identified as having made his job more difficult. When he came in as crops officer, there was no meeting with his predecessor. She was already gone. When he left, his successor had not been named. There was no transition planning process. So he identified that as something he mentioned it to the commissioners in the context of a possible recommendation. Is that a weakness that you plan to address?
Well, I'm not so concerned about if there's a transition, because sometimes someone will leave very quickly and you might not have the benefit of the transition.
But he gave 6 months' notice, and
Yes.
he was asking and asking, could his successor be named? He wants to meet with them. When he left his old position, he actually traveled back just to meet with that person for their benefit, but nobody did that for him. So it was identified as an issue.
No, and why I say I'm not as concerned, I'm more concerned with there has to be a transition process. So when I came in as commissioner, my predecessor had left. But I had a whole team that briefed me on continually for months. Like it would start off with, here's the urgent stuff, here's, as you go on. The same thing I do with the minister. When they changed minister from Minister Blair to Mendocino, I was rebriefing. I had already briefed Minister Blair when he came in the chair. We have a briefing binder, so to speak. We make sure that we prioritize the briefings. We combine briefings. We make sure that he gets the issues. And then obviously there's one-offs. All of a sudden something comes up and you go, oh, okay, we're going to brief you on that. So there has to be a process. There has to be a transition binder. There is processes in place for when the commanding officer, there's a corporate side of the house, strategic planning, they're called, or operational strategy branch. There are different names in different divisions. They're responsible for putting together a transition binder and making sure. So if, in fact, they don't have the benefit of having that time with the person who came before them, there needs to be some form of process for them to get the information they need to be most effective. If we can, in the case of having, I'll give you a recent example, my professional responsibility officer, who's responsible for all conduct matters, grievances, and public complaints in the RCMP, gave enough notice, and we were able to name her replacement. So we brought the replacement in a month in advance, and there was a great transition. When that happens, when we can do that, that should absolutely happen. I agree with you. Sometimes it can't.
Do you agree that that lack of transition management can affect relationships with outside organizations? So, for example, there was a large amount of turnover in senior leadership in H Division in the 2018-2019 period. Now again, 4 major players are gone, and if someone could be in the chair long enough to kind of give the idea of who's who in the province and stuff, would that not help with relations with other provincial and municipal partners?
Absolutely, but I have to say that, in all the time, the 4.5 years I've been commissioner, that was very unusual what happened in H Division with all the people leaving. Obviously, some of it had to do with the effects of the mass casualty. People were leaving a little earlier than their prescribed time, which there's not a set prescribed time, but we have sort of a general guideline. And having 3 of your senior leaders leave at the same time, in all my time in the 4.5 years, we've only had, okay, a crops officer is leaving, so we replace, but the commanding officer is still there, so your corporate knowledge isn't going out the door all at once. So it was very unusual. And then there was a lot of unusual circumstances because we actually had somebody named, ready to go, and then some unusual circumstances occurred. Then we had somebody else named, and unbelievably, some very unusual circumstances occurred. And then out of the, I don't know if it was pure luck, we were able to secure Dennis Daly going back when he was originally slated to go. So it worked out in the end, but it was very painful, I have to say, to watch that happen. And like someone like Chris Leather is thinking, I'm only going to be here for a month or two because that's what usually happens. All of a sudden, those 2 months turned into many more months, and it wasn't a usual way of succession planning that we do. It was just almost like a little bit of a perfect storm that happened there. And so there's lessons to be learned. I've had discussions with our executive officer, resource developing, saying we need to be far more future leaning, looking at doing more succession planning. I hate to say it, but our staffing is not based primarily on succession planning. Sometimes it is actual hole filling, and that's unacceptable. We need to get better at succession planning and know when this person leaves, who is the potential candidates. And if somebody in that group leaves and then all of a sudden we're left with nobody, well, then we need to replenish the potential candidates. We have to get better at succession planning, yes.
I want to ask you about a particular issue that's been cited by municipal chiefs of Nova Scotia as having affected the relationship with the RCMP in 2021 and 2022, including the way it was communicated or not. And what I'm interested in knowing from you is whether it's a Nova Scotia issue or it's happening across the country. And that is the relatively new practice of tracking RCMP expenditures on specialized services used in provincial policing or in municipal areas where it doesn't act as the municipal police force. So historically, at least in Nova Scotia, we've been told that under a legacy provision of the PPSA, this cost was absorbed by the province, where, for example, the RCMP assisted with the ERT team or the FIS team or another specialized service. When Chief Superintendent Leather came in, he started the process of tracking so that the RCMP could account to the provincial government why it was starting in deficit each year. And so is that a change that's happening in all provinces where the RCMP acts as a provincial police force?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question because in 2009, when I was a district officer in Thompson, Manitoba, we actually had a tracking document for the municipal contract that we had with the City of Thompson. And quarterly, I would report specifically on every extra resource or groups of resources that they would receive, attached to file numbers and the amount that it cost. We didn't recover the money, but we showed them that this is what they were getting for nothing. There was a few years before I became commissioner, the government asked for a KPMG study to do to look at the RCMP in regards to funding and resourcing.
What year was that?
I want to say, in 2016-ish, I can't remember. All I know is that out of that, they said to the RCMP, they said to the government, the RCMP is not funded or resourced to do everything you're asking them to do. And we estimate, I think it was in that report, over $700 million of unrecovered money or work that the RCMP has done for other agencies that they have not recovered. And this happens quite a bit, and we're looking at it because obviously in 10 years, we will have a new contract. In 2032, so we need to start talking about the contract. And we have to look at things that are not recovered. So I use the example, the easiest example I use is, for example, witness protection. We do witness protection. It is 100% federally paid for, yet 80 to 90% of the files are provincial. So this is something that the federal side of the RCMP pays for, but it's consumed by 70, 80, depending on what we're talking about, percent is consumed by either municipalities or provinces. So there's a lot of things that aren't being recovered. So it's
when you say provincial, do you mean because they're prosecuted by the province or their criminal code
the person is
offenses?
protected underneath a provincial file, not a federal file.
Okay.
So it's not a national security file that is under the federal policing mandate. It's a criminal code provincial generated file. Yeah. The same would go for surveillance, another example. But it's the
but are you saying
sustainability.
this is a long-standing practice? And if so, where did it originate? Was it from the commissioner of the day saying we need to start tracking, or is it something from the Contract and Indigenous Policing Office?
No, it's not being done from coast to coast to coast, to my knowledge, but in the case of Nova Scotia, when you're trying to present a case and make evidence-based decisions, you need to provide the evidence. So if you're saying, if you're going to go to the province and say, we provide umpteen different dollar amounts of resourcing that are not recovered, which puts us in a deficit at the beginning of the year, well, you ought to do your research. And so that's probably why it was done. We have other entities who have done that, but it's not standard across the country.
My understanding of why some of the municipal chiefs took umbrage at this was that there was some correspondence implying that this wasn't sustainable to keep doing this, and so it was perceived as a threat that the RCMP would stop providing these services. Is that a possibility?
We will never compromise the safety of Canadians. If something that we do, even though we're paying for it and we shouldn't be paying for it, if it's going to compromise the safety of Canadians, we will continue to do it, we will find a way. But if we keep doing that, we get to the point of a breaking point where we may not be able to sustain certain things. So although that activity would not be stopped because we don't want to compromise officer safety, other things might have to drop off the table. And the last thing we want to do is drop things off our own table to sustain activities for different agencies. But again, we won't ever compromise Canadian safety over dollars. We have to figure that out, absolutely.
We've heard that the province of Nova Scotia is about to introduce new policing standards. Will the RCMP follow those standards?
It depends. We've had different divisions who have certain standards that we actually can't because they're against some federal legislation. So if something comes up that is contrary to a federal legislation that we're bound to, we have to figure out a way to reconcile it. I think a good example that comes to my mind is, and I don't know the intimacies, but Clare's Law, when it came into Saskatchewan, we couldn't do it because of the Privacy Act, which is a federal statute. So we weren't allowed to do it in the form it was presented, or the legislation, the way it was presented. Provincially, we would be breaking the Privacy Act if we had enforced it. So we've worked with the province and we worked with the feds, and we found a way to be able to do it. So that's an example where it's not a lack of willingness. Sometimes it's just we would be breaking legislation if we did.
And the RCMP is participating in this process and has a say, but if, for example, the new provincial policing standards conflict with RCMP policies, then the RCMP would follow its own policies?
Policy is adaptable. So legislation not so much, or depending on the guidelines, if it's something that is non-negotiable, we have to figure out a way to work with the province on the standards. It's the same as when we look at body-worn cameras. It's an expensive ticket item. So the government said, we will fund this for a certain period of time to allow you the opportunity to get your funding together so that you can continue to fund it. They didn't flick a switch and say, you are now paying, they've given the notice. So that's an example of trying to work together for the greater good.
I wanted to ask about the connection. Is there a connection between policing standards and costs? So do we know whether revamping policing standards in Nova Scotia would result in increased costs for provincial policing, for example?
It's hard to say. It depends on the standard, but generally speaking, when you change a standard, there is always some type of cost to it. Some of it might be very sustainable. Some might be because you're taking away costs here so you can move money here. There's no set rule that you're automatically raising the costs, because you can up your game without it costing money. You know, it's if we put in a policy for people to do better on a certain part of an investigation, for example, it doesn't mean it's going to cost money. But if it's something that requires training, now we will have to figure out where we're going to get money to create training for that, and that might cost. We may need additional resources for that.
Are you aware of whether there are any discussions as to who would bear those costs?
I'm not intimately involved with the policing standards in Nova Scotia and exactly how they're rolling that out. I know as an organization we look at our own standards, and there's been talk obviously of commissioner's standards, for lack of, that's the word they were using. So for instance, in the McNeil report, they talk about carbines. So when something is that important and that crucial to safety of Canadians and the safety of the officers responding to the safety of Canadians. It shouldn't be that one province has them because they have money and another province doesn't have it, if it's that important, if it's that high risk. So we have to figure out how we can make it so that if we change a standard, that everybody gets to implement that standard at the same time, and it's not a have and a have-not province where that there's different standards if it's that important and that high risk.
So is that a discussion that needs to be had nationally regarding all provinces for which the RCMP acts as a provincial police force?
Well, it's always important when a province is changing their standards, we always bring it into a national headquarters lens, because if a province feels that that is that important that they want to make a standard, maybe it's something that we need to do across the country. And maybe it's just a great idea coming out of this province that they say this. We have to look at it as an organization because of our decentralized nature of our police agency and the different contracts we have. An example is, and it's not a standard, but Alberta brought in a reintegration program when people are off work for an extended period of time, and how they can reintegrate and rebuild their confidence and rebuild their skills to be going back to frontline policing. It was such a great program that we said, well, why would only the members in Alberta get that program? Why don't we roll that out across the country? And how can we do that minimizing cost? And you know, the program was fully baked in Alberta. We didn't have to reinvent the wheel. Another great example out of Nova Scotia is swearing oaths on an eagle feather. Came out of Nova Scotia. We said, my goodness, that's a great initiative. Why wouldn't we do that across the country? Very minimal cost to it, but the idea was there, the policies were there, the procedures, how to implement it. So we just stole it and copy it and use it.
Commissioners, I'm going to be moving to a different area. Would this be a convenient time to break for lunch?
Yes, it would be. We'll break for 1 hour.
Thank you. The proceedings are now on break, and we'll resume in 1 hour.